The neighborhood had always been quiet, a place where manicured lawns and neatly painted shutters gave the illusion of peace. But beneath the surface of this suburban picture-perfect image, an invisible tension simmered, fueled by a homeowners association that saw itself less as a community support group and more as a ruling authority. At the center of this story was Eleanor, a 68-year-old widow who had lived in her home for over 30 years. She and her late husband, Thomas, had built a life here. They had raised children in this modest two-story house, planted the maple tree in the front yard that now shaded the sidewalk, and painted the fence together on warm summer evenings. When Thomas passed unexpectedly after a short illness, Eleanor found herself holding on to the house as her last connection to the life they had built together. To Eleanor, the house wasn't just wood, paint, and bricks. It was memory. Every creak of the floorboards reminded her of nights spent laughing in the living room. Every nail in the deck carried the weight of her husband's hard work. She had no intention of leaving, even if her days now passed in quiet solitude. But the HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Margaret, saw things differently. Margaret had long considered Eleanor's property an eyesore. While most homes had undergone renovations, Eleanor's home still bore the character of decades past. The garden had wildflowers instead of trimmed hedges, the shutters were slightly faded from years of weather, and the fence was in need of paint. None of it was serious, but to Margaret, it was unacceptable. When Eleanor stopped attending HOA meetings after her husband's death, Margaret saw an opportunity. Without Thomas to defend the property, Eleanor became an easy target. The HOA began sending letters. First, they accused her of failure to maintain lawn height requirements. Then came notices about her discolored shutters and faded fence paint. Eleanor did what she could, mowing her grass and trimming back bushes, but her fixed income meant she couldn't hire landscapers or repaint entire sections of the house overnight. Still, the letters grew harsher. Margaret escalated from friendly reminders to threats of fines. Eventually, the HOA board declared that Eleanor had committed repeated maintenance violations and began discussing eviction. They argued that her property was degrading neighborhood value. In reality, it was Margaret's personal vendetta, fueled by arrogance and control. The cruelty of it all was staggering. Here was a grieving widow, quietly minding her own business, and instead of compassion, she was targeted like an enemy. The neighborhood watched in silence. Some neighbors sympathized but whispered only behind closed doors. Others feared the wrath of the HOA themselves. Few dared to openly defend Eleanor. Eleanor, however, was not as fragile as Margaret assumed. She had endured the grief of losing her husband, raised a family, and survived countless struggles in her lifetime. If Margaret thought she could intimidate her into leaving, she was wrong. Eleanor knew she couldn't fight this battle head-on with money or power, but she could fight it with patience, intelligence, and resolve. She began quietly researching. She spent late nights reading HOA bylaws, digging into state housing laws, and learning everything she could about her rights. She visited the county records office, pulling up documents that most people had long forgotten. Every time Margaret sent another threatening letter, Eleanor carefully filed it away. She was building a case, piece by piece, brick by brick, like a fortress of paper and truth. The tension grew thicker as months passed. The HOA board issued their final warning. Eleanor had 30 days to comply with mandatory renovations or face legal action. Margaret was already boasting to her inner circle that soon the old woman would be gone, and they could finally replace her run-down property with something modern. But what Margaret didn't realize was that Eleanor wasn't preparing to surrender. She was preparing for war. And when she struck back, it wouldn't just be for herself. It would be for every neighbor who had ever been bullied by this HOA, every resident who had been silenced, every family who had been fined unfairly. Eleanor's revenge would be slow, meticulous, and devastating. As the deadline approached, Eleanor put her final plan into motion. She had uncovered something in the HOA's own records, something so explosive that it could bring down the entire board. Margaret thought she was about to win, but the truth was, Eleanor was about to pull the rug out from under her. The neighborhood had no idea that the quiet widow on the corner was about to become the HOA's greatest nightmare. Eleanor knew the HOA had underestimated her. Margaret and her board saw her as a weak, grieving widow with no fight left in her. What they didn't know was that Eleanor had spent her career as an administrative assistant in a law office. For decades, she had typed up contracts, organized case files, and watched attorneys dismantle opponents in courtrooms. She might not have had a law degree, but she knew how to find information, how to organize it, and most importantly, how to wait for the right moment to use it. In the evenings, while Margaret and her allies sat comfortably in their pristine homes, Eleanor was in her study, poring over dusty binders and scanned PDF documents she had pulled from county archives. Every HOA has a set of governing documents, often called covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CC&Rs. These documents outlined what the HOA could and could not enforce. They were dry, full of technical jargon, but Eleanor read them carefully, line by line. That's when she began to notice something peculiar. The HOA's authority to fine homeowners was not as broad as Margaret claimed. In fact, there were strict limitations on what fines could be issued, and in Eleanor's case, many of the violations cited didn't even fall under enforceable categories. The HOA had been bluffing, throwing out threats in hopes of scaring homeowners into compliance. But that wasn't all. Digging deeper, Eleanor discovered financial inconsistencies in the HOA's budget reports. Each year, the HOA collected thousands of dollars in dues from homeowners, but the records didn't quite add up. Expenses were vaguely listed, with large sums labeled as miscellaneous improvements or administrative costs. No receipts, no itemized lists, just vague figures. Eleanor's sharp eye noticed the pattern immediately. Someone was mismanaging, or worse, misusing the funds. She didn't stop there. Eleanor contacted the county zoning office to verify some of the HOA's so-called maintenance codes. To her surprise, several of the rules Margaret had cited weren't even in line with county regulations. In other words, the HOA was inventing restrictions out of thin air. It was intimidation, plain and simple. Her discovery gave her energy. For months, she had felt powerless, grieving her husband and dreading each new letter that appeared in her mailbox. But now, with every document she uncovered, the balance of power began to shift. She wasn't just defending her home anymore. She was preparing to expose an entire web of lies. Eleanor also began to observe Margaret closely. The HOA president liked to present herself as a community leader, a woman of influence who knew every rule and enforced it fairly. But her arrogance made her careless. At one meeting Eleanor quietly attended, she overheard Margaret boasting about using HOA funds for necessary travel expenses. Eleanor knew what that meant. The HOA was paying for Margaret's personal luxuries under the guise of official business. Piece by piece, Eleanor built her case. She compiled a thick binder filled with copies of letters, financial records, zoning codes, and bylaws. Every page told a story of abuse of power, corruption, and greed. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. She didn't seek allies. She simply waited, quietly gathering her ammunition, preparing for the moment to unleash it all. The HOA's 30-day deadline was approaching fast. Margaret had already prepared the paperwork to begin legal eviction proceedings. She saw Eleanor's silence as submission, confident the old widow would pack up and leave without a fight. Margaret envisioned herself standing before the community, boasting about how she had saved property values by removing a so-called problem home. But Eleanor had no intention of leaving. She wasn't just going to defend herself, she was going to turn the tables. As the deadline drew closer, Eleanor made one final move. She contacted a local investigative journalist known for exposing corruption in small-town governments and institutions. She didn't reveal everything at once. Instead, she hinted at financial irregularities, misuse of community funds, and abuse of power by HOA leadership. The journalist, intrigued by the possibility of a major scandal in what appeared to be a quiet suburban neighborhood, agreed to meet with her privately. During that meeting, Eleanor handed over copies of her binder. The journalist's eyes widened as she flipped through the evidence. Every accusation Margaret had hurled at Eleanor was minor compared to the mountain of misconduct Eleanor had documented. The journalist promised to dig deeper and assured Eleanor that if even half of what she had uncovered was true, it would be enough to topple the entire HOA board. For the first time since her husband's passing, Eleanor felt a spark of hope. She could almost hear her husband's voice in her head, reminding her of the strength she always carried. Margaret thought she had broken her. Instead, she had awakened a fighter. The night before the deadline, Eleanor sat by the window, watching the maple tree swaying under the moonlight. This was the tree she and Thomas had planted together when they were young, the same tree Margaret had once called a nuisance. Eleanor smiled faintly. She wasn't just defending a house, she was defending a lifetime of memories, a legacy her husband had left behind. Margaret didn't know it yet. She was about to walk straight into Eleanor's trap.
The 30 days had come and gone, and Margaret was more confident than ever. In her mind, the eviction was all but guaranteed. She had stacked the HOA board with people too timid to oppose her, and she believed the neighborhood admired her ruthless approach. To her, Eleanor was a symbol of resistance that had to be crushed, a lesson to anyone who thought they could ignore the association's authority. That morning, Margaret stood tall in front of the HOA's office, a smug smile spreading across her face as she prepared to deliver the official eviction notice. It was a letter written in cold, legal language, demanding that Eleanor vacate her home within 14 days or face further legal action. Margaret relished the thought of Eleanor's reaction, the shock, the fear, the inevitable surrender. But while Margaret was basking in her imaginary victory, Eleanor was calm. She had spent the night organizing her binder one last time, reviewing every detail, making sure nothing was left out. She knew today would not end the way Margaret expected. The sun rose slowly, casting golden light across the neighborhood. Residents, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen, lingered near their windows or strolled casually along the sidewalks, pretending to be busy but keeping their eyes on Eleanor's house. Rumors had already spread. Some believed Eleanor would finally be forced out. Others whispered that she had something planned, though no one knew for sure. When Margaret finally marched up Eleanor's walkway, eviction notice in hand, the air grew tense. She taped the notice to the widow's door with a triumphant flourish, certain she had won. But Eleanor, watching quietly from her window, did not flinch. She let Margaret have her moment, knowing the tables were about to turn. That same afternoon, Eleanor made her move. She walked calmly to the HOA office, carrying her binder, the weight of months of preparation in her hands. She placed it firmly on the board's conference table. Margaret and her allies smirked, assuming Eleanor had come to beg for leniency. But when Eleanor slid the binder toward them, the atmosphere shifted. Inside were copies of everything. Letters filled with fabricated violations, bylaws the HOA had misquoted, financial records riddled with inconsistencies, and zoning codes that directly contradicted their demands. At first, Margaret scoffed, but as the other board members began flipping through the pages, their expressions changed from amusement to concern. Eleanor had not come to plead, she had come to expose. Word of the confrontation spread quickly. By evening, nearly the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Eleanor hadn't just accused Margaret of overstepping her authority. She had revealed evidence of financial misconduct that could potentially lead to criminal charges. People whispered about HOA funds being siphoned into personal expenses, unexplained travel reimbursements, and missing money that should have gone to community improvements. The real blow came the next morning when the local newspaper released a headline that shook the community. Widow exposes HOA corruption, funds misused, rules misapplied. The article detailed everything Eleanor had uncovered, painting her not as a helpless victim, but as a courageous whistleblower. The story spread like wildfire, and suddenly, Margaret was not the neighborhood's savior, but its villain. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak began to share their own stories. One family revealed they had been fined for having the wrong color curtains, another for a child's toy left in the yard. Each tale reinforced Eleanor's claims that the HOA had abused its power for years under Margaret's leadership. The board was in chaos. Some members, terrified of being implicated, distanced themselves from Margaret immediately. Others tried to defend her, but the mounting evidence made their efforts futile. The journalists continued to dig, uncovering even more questionable spending. Margaret's reputation, once carefully polished, unraveled overnight. As for Eleanor, she remained composed. She didn't gloat or lash out. She simply waited, knowing that justice was finally catching up to those who had tormented her. For the first time in months, she felt the crushing weight of fear lift from her shoulders. She had not only defended her home, she had sparked a movement. But Margaret was not ready to surrender. Furious at being humiliated, she doubled down. She claimed Eleanor had fabricated the evidence, that the widow was bitter and vindictive, trying to destroy the community out of spite. She pushed the board to continue with the eviction proceedings, even as public support for Eleanor grew louder. Eleanor anticipated this reaction. Margaret's pride would never allow her to admit defeat, not willingly. That was why Eleanor had saved her most powerful card for last. Among the documents she had uncovered was a paper trail directly tying Margaret to unauthorized withdrawals from HOA accounts. These weren't vague expenses or clerical errors. They were direct transfers into Margaret's personal bank account. Eleanor hadn't released that evidence yet. She was waiting for the perfect moment when Margaret had painted herself into a corner, refusing to back down. Then, when Margaret thought she could still claw her way out, Eleanor would reveal the undeniable truth, the proof that would end Margaret's reign once and for all. The showdown was no longer about weeds, fences, or faded shutters. It was about power, corruption, and pride. The neighborhood was divided between fear and anticipation, watching closely to see how far Margaret would go and how much farther Eleanor was willing to push back. For Margaret, the deadline had passed, and victory felt certain. For Eleanor, the real battle was only just beginning. The widow's trap was set, and soon, the HOA president would walk straight into it. The days following the newspaper article were tense. The once feared HOA had been shaken to its core, but Margaret clung to her crumbling authority with desperation. She paraded through the neighborhood with forced confidence, insisting Eleanor's accusations were lies, smearing the widow's name at every chance she got. Yet no matter how loud she barked, the whispers around her grew louder still. Eleanor, however, stayed quiet. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. The truth was out there, and the community had seen enough to question everything Margaret represented. Instead of wasting her energy in petty back and forth, Eleanor focused on preparing the final phase of her plan. The neighborhood began to shift. Where once residents had feared speaking out against the HOA, now they were emboldened. Couples who had been fined for trivial things pulled old notices out of drawers, showing neighbors the ridiculous demands they had endured. Parents were called late-night knocks from board members demanding bicycles be removed from yards. People compared stories, and soon a collective anger was building. Margaret's carefully maintained image of order was collapsing. She had always believed herself untouchable, but the power she wielded depended on fear, and fear only worked so long as people stayed silent. Eleanor had broken that silence. But Margaret was not finished. She called an emergency HOA meeting, determined to rally her supporters and force through Eleanor's eviction before the momentum against her grew too strong. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday evening, and she ordered every homeowner to attend. Eleanor knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. The trap was set, and Margaret had walked right into it. On the night of the meeting, the community center was packed. Neighbors filled every chair, standing along the walls, buzzing with tension. Margaret took her seat at the front of the room, flanked by her dwindling circle of loyal board members. She opened the meeting with her usual self-assured tone, declaring the importance of upholding standards and protecting property values. She accused Eleanor of waging a personal vendetta, of trying to bring shame on the neighborhood. For a brief moment, her words seemed to sway some of the quieter residents. Margaret had always been persuasive, wielding authority like a weapon. But Eleanor, sitting quietly in the crowd, knew what was coming next would change everything. When Margaret called for a vote on Eleanor's eviction, Eleanor stood. She carried her binder to the front of the room, her steps steady, her face calm. A hush fell over the crowd as she placed the binder on the table and opened it. She began to explain what she had found, not with anger, but with clarity. She pointed out the fabricated violations, the misuse of HOA authority, the misinterpretation of bylaws. She showed copies of financial records, highlighting vague, miscellaneous expenses that totaled thousands of dollars. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as neighbors leaned in, reading for themselves. Then came the moment Margaret hadn't expected. Eleanor pulled out a stack of papers she had held back until now. The bank records. Copies of transactions showing HOA funds transferred directly into Margaret's personal account. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, and angry voices filled the air. Neighbors who had once feared Margaret now turned on her, demanding answers. Margaret's face turned pale, her composure cracking as she stammered, insisting it was all a mistake, that Eleanor had forged the documents. But the evidence was undeniable. Every page bore official bank stamps, signatures, and dates. The board members who had stood by Margaret looked at her with wide eyes, realizing their own reputations were on the line. One by one, they distanced themselves, claiming ignorance, throwing Margaret under the bus in a desperate attempt to save themselves. The crowd's anger grew. Some shouted for Margaret to resign immediately. Others demanded legal action. The once untouchable president sat frozen, her power slipping through her fingers. Eleanor did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood tall, letting the evidence speak for itself. The widow, once seen as weak and vulnerable, had become the community's strongest voice. By the end of the night, the board was in shambles. Margaret stormed out, refusing to answer questions, her once loyal supporters scattering in silence. The vote for Eleanor's eviction never happened. Instead, the community demanded a full investigation into the HOA's finances and leadership. The tide had turned completely. Eleanor was no longer the one on trial. Margaret was. As the neighbors left the meeting, whispers turned into firm declarations. Margaret had abused her power for too long, and now it was time for accountability. Some spoke of contacting law enforcement. Others volunteered to step up and rebuild the HOA in a way that actually served the community, instead of ruling it. Eleanor walked home that night beneath the glow of streetlights, her binder tucked under her arm. She knew the battle was not entirely over. Margaret would fight back, if only to protect her pride. But Eleanor had stripped her of power, exposed her corruption, and ignited a fire in the neighborhood that would not be extinguished. The widow had struck back, and the HOA president's empire was crumbling. The next chapter of this war would not be about threats or fines. It would be about justice. The emergency meeting had been the beginning of the end. Margaret's power, once so absolute, was unraveling before her eyes. Neighbors who had once cowered under her authority no longer returned her greetings. Homeowners whispered openly about her corruption as they walked past her house. Even the board members who had once supported her had turned cold, distancing themselves from her as though betrayal could erase their years of complicity. Margaret tried to regain control. She issued angry emails declaring her innocence, blaming Eleanor for forging documents and spreading lies. She filed formal complaints against Eleanor, accusing her of harassment. But the community wasn't buying it anymore. The evidence was too strong, the transfers too obvious, the lies too transparent. What Margaret hadn't counted on was the persistence of the journalist Eleanor had contacted weeks before. With the story already making headlines, the journalist continued to dig deeper. Within days, another article hit the news, this one even more damning. It outlined not only the personal bank transfers, but also Margaret's extravagant spending habits, vacations booked under the guise of HOA business trips, expensive dinners charged to the association, even luxury items purchased with HOA credit. The neighborhood erupted in outrage. People who had paid dues faithfully for years realized their money had funded Margaret's lifestyle. Parents fumed that the playground equipment remained broken while their fees had bought designer handbags. Elderly residents living on fixed incomes seethed that their contributions had financed beach resorts for Margaret and her friends. The whispers turned into demands. Petitions began circulating, calling for Margaret's immediate removal. Residents who had once been too apathetic or fearful to attend meetings now flooded them, demanding accountability. Eleanor sat quietly at the back of those gatherings, Binder always at her side, watching as the movement she had sparked gained momentum. Then came the blow Margaret could not ignore. A formal audit was launched. The community pooled resources to hire an independent financial investigator, and what they found was worse than anyone imagined. Tens of thousands of dollars had been siphoned away over the course of Margaret's presidency. Some of it had gone directly to her accounts, some disguised as vendor payments to businesses that didn't exist. The evidence was overwhelming. The board had no choice but to act. Margaret was suspended from her role pending investigation, though in truth she had already lost whatever influence she once wielded. Her home, once the proud centerpiece of the neighborhood, became a symbol of corruption. Neighbors passed by in silence, some glaring, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Margaret, furious at being cornered, lashed out in desperation. She threatened lawsuits, calling Eleanor a fraud and the community ungrateful. She even tried to stage small gatherings of loyalists, urging them to fight against what she called a smear campaign. But fewer and fewer showed up. Even those who had once admired her control began to realize the truth. She had used them, lied to them, stolen from them. The collapse of Margaret's reign was not just legal, it was social. Friends who had once clinked glasses with her at neighborhood parties now avoided her calls. People who had once praised her leadership now mocked her arrogance behind closed doors. She had built her power on intimidation, and when that fear vanished, so too did her empire. Meanwhile, Eleanor's life began to change in subtle but powerful ways. Neighbors who had once remained distant now stopped by her house to thank her. Some brought meals, others offered to help with chores around her yard. They saw her not just as a victim, but as the brave widow who had stood up when no one else dared. For Eleanor, who had lived in grief and solitude since her husband's passing, the kindness of her community felt like a long-forgotten warmth. But Eleanor wasn't done. She knew Margaret would try to escape accountability, to frame herself as the true victim, and Eleanor wasn't going to let that happen. With the help of the journalist, she forwarded her evidence to local law enforcement. Bank transfers, emails, forged expense reports, all of it was turned over to investigators. What had started as an HOA feud was now becoming a criminal matter. The day police cars pulled up to Margaret's driveway, the neighborhood gathered in silence.
Curtains twitched, doors cracked open, children whispered to each other. Margaret emerged, red-faced and defiant, shouting that it was all a misunderstanding. But the officer's presence said otherwise. They entered her home, carried out boxes of files, and taped evidence bags shut in front of the watching eyes of the very people she had once ruled over. It was the final humiliation. For years, Margaret had strutted through the neighborhood, wielding authority like a crown. Now she was reduced to a spectacle, her secrets dragged into the open for all to see. The HOA board, desperate to salvage what remained of their credibility, announced immediate elections. For the first time in years, homeowners felt hopeful. They talked about rebuilding the association into something fair and transparent. Some even suggested Eleanor should take a leadership role, but Eleanor politely declined. She had no desire to control her neighbors. She only wanted to live peacefully in the home she and her husband had built. The fall of Margaret was swift and devastating. She had gone from untouchable to disgraced in a matter of weeks. Yet for Eleanor, it wasn't about vengeance alone. It was about justice, about proving that even the most ordinary person could stand up against corruption and win. The neighborhood was forever changed. Fear had been replaced with courage, silence with solidarity, and at the center of it all stood Eleanor, the widow who had been targeted, underestimated, and pushed too far, only to rise stronger than anyone imagined. But Margaret's downfall wasn't the end of the story. There was still the matter of what would come next for the community and how Eleanor's quiet act of defiance would leave a legacy no one could ignore.
The dust took weeks to settle after Margaret's downfall. The once feared HOA president was now nothing more than a disgraced figure whose name became a cautionary tale whispered with bitterness across the neighborhood. With the financial investigation still ongoing, Margaret rarely left her house. Where she had once strutted down the sidewalks, she now slinked to her car in the early morning, avoiding the eyes of the neighbors who had once been forced to smile in her presence. The HOA board, stripped of its figurehead, dissolved in disarray. Resignations came quickly, each member hoping to escape responsibility before the audit revealed their complicity. For the first time in years, the neighborhood found itself without an active HOA, and to the surprise of many, life carried on more peacefully without it. In the midst of this change, Eleanor became something she never set out to be, a symbol. Neighbors who had once avoided her house out of fear of Margaret's wrath now stopped by regularly. They brought her pies, fresh vegetables from their gardens, or just kind words. People who had once whispered about her lawn or her shutters now praised her courage. Children waved when they passed her yard, calling out greetings. Parents encouraged their kids to shovel her walkway in winter or rake leaves in autumn. Eleanor had lived in solitude since Thomas's death, but the community had embraced her now. For the first time in a long time, she no longer felt alone. Yet Eleanor did not view herself as a hero. To her, it had never been about recognition or power. It was about protecting her home, the last place where her memories of Thomas lived. She often sat on her porch, watching the maple tree sway in the breeze, thinking of the day they had planted it together. Her fight had been for that, for the life they had built, and for the principle that no one had the right to take it away. But the impact of her stand stretched far beyond her own yard. The neighborhood changed in small but meaningful ways. Without Margaret's iron grip, people felt freer to make their homes their own. Lawns were no longer inspected with hostility. Families hung holiday lights without fear of fines. Neighbors gathered more often, building friendships where once there had only been suspicion. Eventually, the community voted to re-establish the HOA, but with an entirely different structure. This time, the board was composed of residents who valued fairness, transparency, and cooperation. Rules were simplified, focusing only on genuine safety concerns rather than controlling aesthetics. Dues were lowered after the wasteful spending was eliminated. Meetings became opportunities for collaboration rather than scenes of intimidation.
The new leadership repeatedly asked Eleanor to take a position on the board. She declined each time, gently but firmly. She had done her part, and she had no desire to govern others. Her role had been to break the old system, not to build the new one. That task, she said, belonged to the next generation of homeowners. Still, her presence loomed large. Every decision the new board made carried the memory of what Eleanor had endured. Whenever someone suggested stricter rules or harsher fines, another would quickly remind them of what happened under Margaret. Eleanor had become the conscience of the neighborhood, a reminder that power, if unchecked, could corrupt even the most ordinary of places. As for Margaret, her fate was sealed when the financial investigation concluded. The missing funds, the forged records, the unauthorized transfers, all were undeniable. Facing legal consequences, she was forced to resign officially and sell her home. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood left in silence, her moving truck pulling away as neighbors watched without waving. Her empire of fear was gone, erased as though it had never existed. When the news of Margaret's departure reached Eleanor, she felt no triumph. She had never sought Margaret's ruin, only justice. She sat quietly on her porch that evening, looking at the sunset through the branches of her maple tree. In her heart, she hoped Margaret might reflect on her choices, though she doubted the woman ever would. In the months that followed, Eleanor's life regained a rhythm of peace. She tended her garden, often with the help of children who enjoyed planting flowers alongside her. She hosted small gatherings on her porch, sipping tea with neighbors who had once been strangers. The home that had once been a target for eviction had become a hub of warmth and connection. Her story, however, did not stay confined to the neighborhood. The journalist who had first reported on her case continued to share updates, framing Eleanor as an example of resilience and courage. Local media outlets referred to her as the widow who took down the HOA. For many across the city, she became a symbol of hope, proof that even ordinary people could stand against corruption and win. But to Eleanor, her legacy was simpler. She didn't care about headlines or praise. Her victory was in the quiet mornings when she watered her flowers without fear of fines. It was in the laughter of children playing in the yard without parents worrying about complaints. It was in the neighbors who now stopped to talk instead of hurrying past. The house she had fought so hard to protect still stood strong. Its shutters were still faded, its fence still weathered, but to Eleanor, it was perfect. It held the memories of her past and the promise of her future. It was hers, not because the HOA allowed it, but because she had claimed her right to stay. In the end, Eleanor's revenge was not the destruction of Margaret, though that had come naturally. Her true revenge was in the life she reclaimed, the peace she restored, and the community she transformed. Margaret had tried to evict her from her home, but instead, she had evicted fear from the entire neighborhood. And as the seasons changed and the maple tree grew taller, Eleanor sat on her porch with quiet pride, knowing that her husband would have been proud of her. The widow who was once underestimated had become legendary, not through anger, but through resilience, courage, and the refusal to be silenced. Her legacy lived not in the downfall of her enemy, but in the freedom of her community.